In this lesson, we're going to consider transfer payments from the government to individuals. There's many examples of transfer payments in the United States and in other countries. Sometimes they're called entitlement spending because they're built into the law. You get them under certain circumstances, and entitlement is the word for that. There's two major categories of transfer payments. One sometimes called social insurance programs, and that would include Social Security, which is a program for which the elderly get a payment from the government after they've retired. And another example is Medicare. That's also for the elderly. That's payments for health care, for health insurance for the elderly. And then there's unemployment insurance, which is what workers get when they're laid off. If they're in the employment insurance program, if they get laid off from their job for a while, they get checks from the government, which is effectively what's called unemployment insurance. So those are all examples of insurance programs that are payments to individuals. They don't depend on the income of the individual. Everybody gets Social Security, rich and poor alike. Everyone's eligible for Medicare, rich and poor alike, and unemployment insurance, rich and poor alike as well. The other kinds of program is called means-tested programs, and these do depend on your income. And there's several here in this example. One is called Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. It used to be called AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, until the 1990s, 1996 to be particular, where there was welfare reform that transformed the AFDC into this temporary assistance program for needy families. This is a program sometimes just called welfare, for which low-income people or poor people are able to apply to get assistance from the government. It's kind of a social safety net to make sure people don't really become almost no income, and so basically it helps at the very bottom. Medicaid is also an insurance program for low-income people. Below a certain income, they're eligible to be part of Medicaid, which is an insurance program for medical care. Food stamps also for low-income people. Food stamps are a way to get coupons or stamps to actually buy food. And so that's also an example of means tested. Your income's supposed to be below a certain level. And finally, the tax system also provides assistance to people with something called the refundable earned income tax credit. And this is a tax credit rather than a tax you pay. You actually get money from the government if your income from work is below a certain amount. So those are the examples in the two major categories, and we'd like to analyze these and try to figure out how they work. It's an important part of the budget. It's an important part of the economic system. Give an example to see how both the tax system and the tax credit, refundable tax credit, works for an example family, just to keep this in mind. So here's a family of four, earns $35,000. As we know from our study of the taxes, they get a standard deduction over their income of $12,200. They also, since there's four in this family, they get to deduct $15,600 as an exemption. And so their taxable income is $7,200. This family would be in the lowest income tax bracket, the lowest marginal tax rate, so they would pay 10% of the $7,200 or $720 in taxes in the income tax system. But then there are the credits, which are really aimed at lower income individuals. There's the child credit, which you get $1,000 per child. This family has two children. It gets to take off $2,000 if you like. That's the amount shown in parentheses. And then there's the earned income tax credit, which is another $1,000. So the $3,000 is a payment, refundable it's called. It's paid even if if it's larger than the amount of taxes. So if you subtract the $720 from the $3,000, this family will actually get a payment from the government of $2,280 entirely through the tax system. This is not including other things such as the food stamps or the temporary assistance to needy families. It's just the tax system itself, and that represents the magnitude to think about as you go through and consider transfer, because this is really like a transfer payment working through the tax system. It's important also to think quantitatively about the size of the entitlements in the U.S. economy, when you're thinking about these things, these are some important facts to recognize. It turns out that now about 40% of households without a senior citizen present, so they don't get Social Security, receive some form of entitlement payment. So nearly half of the households in the United States, even those without a senior citizen, if you have a senior citizen in the household, you're automatically getting Social Security payments. So this is taking those out, it's still 47%. Second fact, more than 50% of American children now live in households receiving some kind of a federal entitlement benefit. So it's quite expansive in terms of children. And then finally, 80% of households headed by a single mother receive entitlement programs, which is obviously a large number of people getting assistance. So it's a widely penetrated system, widely used system in the United States at this time. The other thing to think about with respect to the transfer system is its impact on individual behavior. Much like taxes affect the amount of labor supplied or the amount of goods consumed or produced, the transfer system works in a very similar way. It's actually very much like a marginal tax rate. And this diagram is supposed to try to illustrate that. The common sense behind this is that as you earn more income, your assistance in the form of transfers goes down. And that affects effectively the marginal amount you get from working more. So for example, in the upper part of the diagram, you can see hours of worked on the horizontal axis, and the total income on the vertical axis. That's hours of work on the horizontal axis and total income on the vertical axis. The line that goes up from the origin there, from the beginning, represents your income from work. That's your payment, your salary, or your wages from your job for this particular example. And then the welfare payment, which we've seen examples of, will give that amount when your income is zero, and then it will start to decline as you earn more until you're off the welfare completely. And so when you look at that diagram, note that the slope of the total amount of income is nearly flat. It's much lower, much smaller slope than the curve without the transfer payment system. And that represents a disincentive to really work because you're getting relatively little from it. Your income is rising just a little bit as you earn compared to a lot here. And so that's the disincentive, the marginal tax rate effect on incentives. If you think about how you might fix this problem with some kind of a reform, well, there's really only two ways to deal with it, as illustrated in this diagram. One is to phase out the welfare more slowly, and that's in the next diagram. So in this case, you start with the same amount as up here, but then you reduce it more slowly, and so people at that level of income are still getting some welfare payments, where before you made that reform, they're not. And so this is a possible way to make the slope of this line steeper, which you want to do here. So there's some incentives to work, but it means paying welfare payments, transfer payments to people who have relatively high incomes up here in this picture. And so there's a disadvantage of that. Of course, you don't want to be paying payments to rich people or middle-income people. It's supposed to be for poor people. It's supposed to be helping people with low incomes. And in this case, you'd be helping people with high incomes. So it's a problem in terms of reform, although it does get the incentive problem dealt with. And then the bottom, you see another way to try to reform, and this also has its problems. In this case, you get the line to be steep, so you have that incentive to work. But to do that, you've had to reduce the amount for people who are at the very bottom, the very poor people. And so that's a disadvantage as well. So this is in a way a trade-off, if you like, a trade-off between how much you're able to provide assistance, and you want to provide assistance to low-income people, and the trade-off of the disincentive that might cause for people to actually work, and the fact that you don't want to have your welfare system go to people who don't need it, who have upper incomes. That's the fundamental trade-off that policymakers face when they consider the welfare system itself. Now, let's give an example of how this works, and let's give an example with respect to the new health care law that is being implemented. Because the same kind of thing must occur with respect to this kind of program, because it also represents payments to individual. So just to review, the Affordable Care Act, or more formally the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, provides subsidies to buy private insurance for individuals. The way it works now is if your income is up to 133% of the poverty line, then a family can go on Medicaid, a program for low-income individuals. The poverty line in 2014 is $23,300 for a family of 4, so those people would be able to go on Medicaid. If your income is higher, in particular between 133% and 400% of the poverty line, then you have a subsidy, but it's phased out as your income rises. In this case, the subsidy is to buy insurance from private insurance companies rather than go through the government Medicaid program, Medicaid being reserved for the lower income people below 133% of the poverty line. So given this program, let's figure out where the disincentives are. We know there must be. So consider a family of 4, or the 55-year-old head of household, and suppose they're earning $80,000. In this case, the health care subsidy is $16,100, or what that means is their total income is $96,100. Now, if they are considering working more, or another member of the family is considering working more, and let's suppose the extra work would generate $15,000 of income, then their income would rise to $95,000. But with $95,000, the law would not give them any subsidy to buy insurance. They would be considered earning too much, too rich. For $80,000, you get an amount. For $95,000, you don't. But what that, of course, means in this example is that they will actually lose money, not get just a smaller amount of money, but actually lose money if they work more. And they would get a $15,000 increase in their salary, but they would lose $16,100 in the healthcare subsidy. So it's a big disincentive, and that is a fact that has to be there for any kind of a program like this. You want to try to make sure it's not as large as this, but it exists in any case. You can also illustrate this one with the same kind of diagram I showed before. So this is actually a specific example based on the healthcare law. So like the diagrams that I showed before, which show the reduction in welfare, this has income from work on the horizontal axis. It has the total income on the vertical axis. And you can see the income from work rises there. The more you work, the more you get in terms of income. But in addition, there's the subsidy, the healthcare subsidy, which is generated there, that raises the income. But then it's phased out. It's phased out slowly, and then it's just dropped off. And so it's that number we were talking about, where you're actually going to reduce your income as you move up in terms of hours of work, and that's the disincentive that's caused. So disincentives are always there. They're part of the system. You try to make them have the least of impact that's possible. Finally, let me just give you a number that thinks about the magnitudes and why one's interested in entitlements in the overall budget system for the United States, the overall budget for the United States. This is just a picture of what the U.S. government is spending on entitlement programs, a couple of examples, and what it's expected to be spending in the future. This is a projection based on the Congressional Budget Office, which is supposed to be estimating these things. They're good estimates of what is happening with the current law. And you can see now in this picture, we're showing the healthcare spending by the federal government, so that would be the Medicare, the new healthcare system, the Medicaid, and the Social Security, which we've discussed, is shown in red. And both are shown as a fraction of GDP. So these are, since the total is rising, we're spending more and more and projected to spend more and more of federal funds on these programs over time. And many people think that's a problem because it really puts a lot of pressure on the budget. And in this picture, it's clear that the healthcare is a big part of that problem. So there need to be reforms. If we make this continue to go without changing things, then taxes will have to rise more and more. The budget deficit will get bigger and bigger, as we'll see more in the class. But just to summarize, we've done, in our looking at the transfer payment system, we've given an example of some of the programs. We've given an examination of those programs on individuals, and now we're showing the overall impact on the economy, not only in terms of the total dollars spent in this picture, but also in terms of the fraction of people that are being supported by these transfer programs and entitlement programs. Thank you.